Tonight, we're not here to fix anything, not to understand everything, not to become someone better before you're allowed to rest. This is a quiet space where we gently let go and return to inner peace through soft Zen stories inspired by the Buddha, shared slowly so your mind can soften and your body can rest. Maybe today asked a little too much from you. Too many thoughts, too many worries, too many small things you tried to hold together. And maybe, just for this moment, you're ready to set them down. Here, you don't need to improve yourself. You don't need to solve tomorrow. You are already enough simply by being here, breathing quietly. Just for a moment. Where are you listening from tonight? Wherever you are, I'm grateful you're here, sharing this quiet space. Let your breath slow as if it remembers the way home. Let your shoulders soften like they no longer need to carry the world. Tonight, we'll listen to a simple story. A story from ordinary life, carrying a small thread of Zen and Buddhist wisdom. Not to give you more to think about, but to help you loosen your grip. Because suffering rarely ends by force. It softens when we stop holding it so tightly. There's nothing to rush, nothing to achieve, only a gentle drifting into rest, into stillness. Whether you stay awake or slowly fall asleep, this moment is already enough. And now, we begin tonight's journey with these Zen stories. Some things are handed to us without being asked for. Not gifts, but words, a tone, a comment wrapped in irritation. And we often assume that because it was sent, it automatically belongs to us. But maybe like any other gift, if we don't accept it, it stays with the person who offered it. Jasmine was 34, a real estate agent used to her phone buzzing all day long. Quick texts, rushed calls, promises made while everyone was tense. That evening, she pulled up in front of her house, turned off the engine, but didn't get out right away. The streetlight reflected off the windshield, casting a dim glow just enough to see the dashboard clearly. Her phone vibrated. A voicemail. The caller's name appeared. Jasmine knew that voice. She had heard it many times on good days and on difficult ones. She didn't open it immediately. She just stared at the screen for a few seconds, as if considering a door. Finally, she pressed play. The voice came through not loud, but sharp, not openly insulting. Just sentences laced with disappointment, blame, and a subtle edge of contempt carefully packaged. When the voicemail ended, the screen went quiet again. But inside Jasmine, it didn't. She placed the phone face down on the seat beside her. Her hand trembled slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to feel it. A familiar heat rose in her chest, not exploding, just spreading slowly, like holding something that isn't very hot, but burns if you hold it long enough. Jasmine thought about calling back, thought about the sharp responses she could deliver, thought about explaining herself, then thought about staying silent, Each thought opened a different path, but they all started in the same place. She was holding something that had just been handed to her. She breathed in, then out. Not deep, not long, just enough to notice she had been holding her breath. She looked at the phone face down, lying still like an ordinary object. Nothing in it was demanding an immediate response. There was no countdown clock, no rule forcing her to open her hands and receive it. Jasmine remembered an old question she'd heard somewhere before. If someone gives you a gift, but you don't accept it, who does the gift belong to? She didn't think about it as a moral lesson. It simply appeared clear and real, right there on the passenger seat beside her. The words in that voicemail, however unpleasant, were only sounds that had already passed. They couldn't enter her body unless she opened the door. But her habit, like many people's, was to open that door quickly, to take it in, and carry it along. Jasmine rested her hand on the steering wheel. Her fingers touched the cool surface. She noticed the contrast between that coolness and the heat spreading in her chest. Both existed at the same time. And for the first time that evening, she realized she had a very small choice to set the phone aside or to keep holding it. She chose to set it down, not to throw it away, not to block the number, just to turn it face down so the screen couldn't look at her anymore. A small movement, but it created a necessary distance, like placing an object that doesn't belong to you back on the table. Jasmine opened the car door and stepped outside. The night air was cooler than the air inside the car. She took a longer breath than before. The heat didn't disappear immediately, but it stopped being fed. No replies formed in her mind. No new story took shape. She locked the car, heard the familiar click, and walked toward the front door. The phone stayed in her pocket silent. The gift was still there, but it hadn't been accepted. And that alone was enough to send the evening in a different direction. Jasmine stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The sound was soft, just enough to signal that the long day was now outside. She didn't turn on all the lights. She left only the gentle glow from the living room, just enough to see where she was going. The quiet welcomed her without asking for anything more. She set her keys on the table, hung up her jacket, and stood still for a few seconds. Not out of hesitation, just letting her body recalibrate like after leaving a noisy place. In that quiet pause, Jasmine noticed that her phone was still silent in her pocket. No vibration, no light, nothing reminding her that something needed a response. She took the phone out and placed it on the table beside the sofa face down. Not a dramatic gesture, just setting it there like placing an unopened package off to the side. She sat down, leaning back into the soft cushions. Her shoulders dropped slightly, almost without her noticing. The words from the voicemail were still echoing faintly in her mind, but they no longer felt as sharp as they had earlier, when they weren't being picked up and turned over again and again. They began to fade like a distant sound lowering its own volume. Jasmine wasn't trying to forget. She just wasn't replaying it anymore. She went into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. Cool, clear. She drank in small sips, feeling her throat soften. Sometimes taking care of the body in the simplest way is the quickest way for the mind to stop arguing. Back on the sofa, Jasmine sat for a while. She didn't turn on the news. She didn't open social media. Those places often carry even more unrequested gifts. Tonight, she didn't need to accept anything else. She thought about how many words over the years she had taken in that didn't really belong to her. Taken out of politeness, taken out of habit, taken out of fear that silence would make things worse. But silence sometimes is just closing the window when the wind gets too strong. Jasmine stood up and went into the bathroom, splashing cool water on her face. It washed away the fatigue of the day. When she lifted her head, she looked at herself in the mirror. Not inspecting, not judging, just seeing someone who was learning not to open her hands so quickly anymore. She dried her face, turned off the light, and walked slowly toward the bedroom. Each step steady, unhurried. The phone stayed in the living room. She didn't bring it with her. She didn't need to. Tonight, there was no conversation that needed to keep going in her head. When she lay down, Jasmine pulled the blanket up to her shoulders. The temperature was just right. The air in the room was cool and still. She turned onto her side, finding her familiar position. Her body responded almost immediately, as if it had been waiting for this moment. If those words return at another time, that's okay. They can exist somewhere, but they don't need to be held. Not everything that's offered needs to be accepted to prove anything. Jasmine closed her eyes. She didn't force herself to sleep. She let her eyelids grow heavy with the rhythm of her breath. Inhale, exhale, slow and even. No reaction waiting, no answer being prepared. Some nights peace comes from realizing you're allowed to refuse gently, without explaining, without pushing back, simply by not opening your hands. The room settled into silence. Everything was in its place. And in that stillness, sleep arrived without words, like setting a gift back where it truly belongs. Some things, when we hold on to them for too long, slowly dry us out. Not because they're too heavy, but because we repeat them day after day until they become the only thing we remember. Meanwhile, the good things, if we don't hold them carefully, slip away quickly as light as footprints in the sand. Grace was 62, a librarian for many years before retiring. She was used to quiet, to slow movements, and to observing more than speaking. That morning, she went to the beach earlier than usual. The air was still misty, the shoreline long and nearly empty. The waves rolled in steadily, neither strong nor hurried. Grace slipped off her shoes and carried them in her hand, letting her bare feet sink into the cool sand. Each step left a clear mark behind her. She didn't look back right away. She simply felt her walking rhythm blend with the rhythm of the waves. There was a special kind of softness in the early morning, when nothing had yet taken on the stories of the day. She stopped near the water's edge, bent down, and used her finger to write a word in the sand. Not a name, not a full sentence. Just a familiar word, one tied to a memory she had carried for many years. When she finished, she stood up and stepped back. A wave came in. Not fast, not strong, but enough to reach the word. Its edges blurred. Then another wave arrived, and the word nearly disappeared. Grace watched without a sense of loss. Only a small feeling of relief, like exhaling after holding your breath longer than you realized. She thought back to the early days after losing her partner. The pain then was sharp, unmistakable. Over time, though, it changed shape. It no longer knocked her down, but stayed as a line written over and over inside her. Each time she remembered, she rewrote it again without noticing. Grace didn't blame herself for that. Everyone has things that are hard to let go of. But standing here with the sea in front of her, she suddenly saw something clearly. Maybe not everything needs to be carved deeply to prove it once mattered. She continued walking along the beach. A little farther on, a large rock rose up, its surface smoothed by wind and water. Grace stopped and placed her hand on it. The stone was cool and solid, unmoving. She didn't write on it. She just rested her hand there, feeling its steady presence. Another image appeared in her mind, not of loss, but of an afternoon many years ago, when someone had held her hand tightly at a moment she needed it most. Such a small gesture, yet it had stayed with her for so long. It didn't need to be repeated to remain. It never faded. Grace felt the contrast clearly. Some things are meant to be carried away by the tide, and some are meant to be kept, not by repeating them, but by carving them into something strong enough to hold them. She sat down on the rock and watched the sea grow brighter. The waves continued to erase her footprints in the sand. No mark lasted long, but the beach didn't lose its shape because of that. It remained whole in its own way. Grace breathed in, then out slowly. Not as a ritual, just a breath that matched the morning. She didn't need to decide anything right now. She only needed to see that she didn't have to carry every pain like a rare possession. Some things are allowed to fade. She stood up, slipped her shoes back on, and walked slowly toward the path. Behind her, the sand smoothed itself out, no trace of the word left behind. But the rock was still there, and the feeling of that long-ago handhold was too. Grace left the beach once the sun had risen high enough for the thin mist to fade. The small road leading home was still quiet, houses closed up, as if the whole neighborhood was lingering in sleep a little longer. She walked slowly, not from tiredness, but because there was no need to rush. When she reached home, Grace placed her shoes by the door and rinsed her feet under cool water. The sand washed away quickly, leaving no trace behind. She dried her feet and stood still for a moment, feeling the cool floor beneath her. Small sensations like that, when noticed, often help the mind stop circling back to old loops. In the living room, morning light slipped through the curtains, stretching long bands across the wooden floor. Grace sat down in her familiar chair by the window. A few old photographs rested neatly on the table. She didn't pick them up. She didn't need to. Those images had been held long enough. She thought about the difference between remembering and clinging. Remembering allows something to have a quiet place in the heart. Clinging drags it everywhere, never letting it rest. She realized that for many years she had been doing both at once, and it had tired her more than necessary. Grace stood up and opened the window. Morning air flowed in, carrying a faint saltiness from the sea. The breeze stirred the curtains gently. Nothing was disturbed. It was just the soft movement of a new day beginning. She returned to her chair and closed her eyes for a short while. Not to stop her thoughts completely, just to let them pass without sticking. Old images drifted by, then moved on. No need to hold. No need to push away. Grace noticed that the good things in her life had never needed constant repetition to stay real. They were there, solid as stone, even without being named. And the painful things, when allowed to be carried off by the wind, no longer felt as sharp as before. The morning passed slowly. Grace made a cup of tea and set it on the table, watching the steam rise and disappear. She took a small sip, feeling the warmth spread. Nothing remarkable, but enough. As afternoon arrived, the light shifted. Grace didn't return to the beach. She didn't need to. The morning moment was enough to stay with her through the day. It didn't need to be repeated to prove it was real. That evening, Grace prepared to sleep early. She turned off most of the lights, leaving the familiar dim glow. When she lay down, she didn't think about the words she had written in the sand. They were gone. She didn't cling tightly to the good things either. They were already there. Her breathing was steady and light. There was no sense of lack. Nothing that needed to be resolved before sleep. Just a clear distinction between what needed to be let go and what was allowed to remain. If old memories return tomorrow, Grace knows she can write them in the sand again. Not to avoid them, but to give them a way out. And if something kind appears, she knows she can carve it a little deeper without fear of losing it. The room settled into quiet. No conclusions, no reminders. Just someone who had learned where to write, and a body finally allowed to rest. And in that stillness, sleep arrived naturally, like waves finishing their work on the sand, while the stone remained quietly in place. Some anger doesn't come from a big event. It comes from telling a small story too many times. Each time we retell it, we throw another dry branch into the fire. The fire doesn't explode on its own. It simply does what the wood allows it to do. Kevin was 37, an accountant used to tidy numbers and workdays that ended on time. But that evening he got home later than usual. Not because of extra work, just a meeting that ran 10 minutes long, followed by a comment that seemed harmless, said right as everyone stood up to leave. Kevin didn't react then. He smiled lightly, nodded, packed his things. Everything stayed polite. But once he got home, kicked off his shoes by the door, the anger began to take clearer shape. Not loud, just hot. He went straight into the bathroom and turned on the shower. Hot water poured over his shoulders, steam quickly fogging the mirror. The space closed in, leaving only the steady sound of water washing out everything else. Kevin stood there with his eyes closed, letting the water hit his back, the usual end-of-day routine. In his mind, the meeting replayed. Every sentence, every look. Kevin thought about what he should have said, how he should have answered, how he should have clarified things right then. Each should was another dry branch tossed into the fire. The flame didn't flare up immediately, but it grew a little hotter. The water kept running. The steam thickened. Kevin pressed a hand against the tiled wall, warm under his palm. He noticed his jaw was clenched. His shoulders were lifted higher than normal. His body was reacting to a conversation that had already ended. He opened his eyes and looked at the blurred mirror. The reflection was vague, just a figure standing still in the steam. And it hit him. The event was over. But in his head, it was still happening. Edited, expanded, repeated. Sometimes we think we're processing anger by thinking it through, but often we're just feeding it. Every branch is dry because it comes from memory. And memory, when pulled out again and again, catches fire easily. Kevin adjusted the shower, letting the water turn slightly cooler. Not much, just enough to feel the difference. The steam began to thin. The fire in his chest didn't grow anymore. It paused, waiting. He tried something else. He didn't keep retelling the story. He didn't argue in his head. He didn't prepare imaginary responses. He just stood there with the water, with his breath, with a body that was heating up, then slowly cooling down. This felt different from holding it in. It felt like not throwing anything else into the fire. For a few seconds, a kind of quiet appeared. Not outside, but inside. Not a big empty space, just a small opening where the anger wasn't being fed. Kevin noticed that without new wood, the fire changed. It was still there, but it wasn't sharp anymore. He turned off the shower and stepped out, wrapping a towel around himself. Cool air touched his skin clearly. Kevin breathed in, then out. Not deep, not long. Just enough to notice his chest wasn't tight anymore. In the mirror, his reflection slowly came back as the steam faded. Nothing special, no look of triumph. Just someone who had stopped in the middle before the fire could spread. Kevin dried his hair and hung the towel on the hook. Familiar motions, steady, thoughtless. In his mind, the meeting story wasn't running anymore. It still existed, but it wasn't being told. Like embers cooling once no one stirs them. He stepped out into the living room. The light was soft. The space was quiet. Kevin sat down and felt his body sink slightly in a comfortable way. Not exhausted, just no longer tense. Some nights what drains us isn't the first spark of anger. It's all the dry wood we add afterward, believing we're making things clearer. But fire doesn't need clarity. It only needs fuel. Kevin leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. The fire inside him wasn't completely out, but it wasn't being fed anymore. And that alone was enough for the evening to begin to soften. Kevin sat quietly on the sofa. He didn't turn on the TV. He didn't pick up his phone. The room was lit only by the soft yellow glow of a lamp in the corner. This space didn't ask him to react, to keep thinking, or to prepare for anything. It simply allowed him to be still. The anger from earlier hadn't disappeared completely. It was still there like glowing embers after the flames have pulled back. But when Kevin didn't stare at it, didn't poke at it, it began to cool on its own. No water needed, no force, just time and quiet. He stood up, went into the kitchen, and poured himself a glass of water. The sound of water filling the glass was barely audible. Kevin drank in slow sips, feeling his throat soften, sometimes bringing attention back to the body, is the fastest way to stop the mind from spinning. Back on the sofa, Kevin stretched his legs out in front of him. The backrest supported his weight. His shoulders dropped lower than before, his jaw unclenched. Small signs, but his body noticed immediately. It knew when it no longer needed to stay on guard. In Kevin's mind, the meeting from earlier appeared only faintly now. No clear sentences, no chain of imagined replies. When a story isn't repeated, it shortens on its own, like a fire without wood, first dim red, then gray. He realized something very simple. Not every thought needs to be followed all the way through to be considered processed. Some thoughts finish their work the moment we stop feeding them. Kevin walked into the bedroom. No rush, no phone in hand. He turned on a small lamp just enough to see. As he sat on the bed, he felt the difference between now and when he'd first come home. His body felt heavier in a comforting way, no longer tight like a drawn string. He lay down and pulled the blanket up to his shoulders. The temperature was just right. The room was cool and still. Kevin turned onto his side, finding his familiar position. No thought jumped up demanding to be resolved. What remained was only a faint afterglow, like warmth lingering in a kitchen after cooking is done. Some anger doesn't need to be overcome. It just needs to stop being retold. When the story ends, the fire no longer knows where to burn. Kevin closed his eyes. He didn't force himself to sleep. He let his eyelids grow heavy. His breath moved in then out, steady and even. Each breath felt like a small pause between the remaining thoughts. And in those pauses, his body did what it knows how to do. If tomorrow, when he remembers that meeting, the anger rises again just a little, Kevin knows he'll recognize the familiar moment. This is where I'm about to throw in more wood. And just like tonight, he can choose not to. Not because he's weak, but because it isn't necessary. The room slowly settled into silence. No conclusions, no promises. Just a fire no longer being fed and a body returning to its safe, natural state. And in that quiet sleep arrived naturally, like the last embers finally cooling, leaving just enough warmth to keep the night from feeling cold. The mirror didn't break loudly. Grace noticed it the next morning when the light from the porch hit the glass at an angle it didn't usually reach. A thin line ran across the corner, quiet and pale, like something that had happened while no one was watching. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, holding her coffee, letting the kettle click off behind her. She didn't remember dropping it. She didn't remember a sound in the night. Just this line now here. Grace was 62, retired, the kind of person who noticed small things because life had finally slowed down enough to make room for them. She set the mug down, touched the edge of the mirror with one finger, careful not to press. The glass was still smooth. The crack didn't cut. It just interrupted. Later that evening, she carried the mirror out to the porch. The swing creaked gently as she sat down, the same sound it had made for years, steady and familiar. Crickets were already starting up in the yard. She rested the mirror against her knees, tilted slightly, catching the dim gold of the porch light. There had been a time when Grace would have thrown it out right away. Broken meant done. Replace it. Move on. But she didn't feel rushed tonight. She took a cloth from her pocket and wiped the surface slowly, not trying to fix anything, just clearing the dust. Her reflection fractured as she moved her face, appearing in pieces that didn't quite line up. It was strange how even a small break could change the whole image. Grace thought about how anger works the same way. It doesn't always come in shouting or slam doors. Sometimes it settles in quietly. It waits. It turns into distance, into silence, into the way you stop expecting anything good from someone without ever saying so out loud. She had been carrying that kind of anger for a long time. Not the explosive kind, the tidy kind. The kind you keep folded neatly, like a letter you never sent. Years ago, someone close to her had said something that couldn't be taken back. It wasn't dramatic. No betrayal, no shouting. Just a sentence that landed wrong and stayed there. A comment that made her feel small in a moment when she had trusted enough to be open. Grace never confronted it. She told herself it wasn't worth it, that she was being mature, reasonable. But the anger didn't disappear. It just hardened into something quieter. She adjusted the mirror on her lap. The crack caught the light again, more visible now. She wondered how many times she had replayed that moment in her head over the years, polishing it, turning it, letting it reflect different versions of the same hurt. Forgiveness had always sounded to her like pretending the crack wasn't there, like forcing the glass back into a shape it no longer had. She wasn't interested in that. The porch was cool now. A breeze moved through the trees, lifting the leaves just enough to make them whisper. Grace rested her hands on the frame of the mirror and let her shoulders drop. Not in a dramatic way, just enough to notice the weight she'd been holding. There's something exhausting about anger that doesn't get expressed. It stays active. It keeps checking the past, like it might change if you look at it one more time. It sharpens your memory. It edits your expectations. It makes the world feel a little harder than it needs to be. Grace hadn't realized how much of her energy had been leaking into that old moment until now, sitting here watching her reflection split and rejoin with every shift of light. She thought about what it would mean to fix the mirror. Not to make it invisible, not to erase the crack, but to let it exist differently. Years ago, she had seen a documentary about a Japanese art form, kintsugi, broken pottery repaired with gold. The cracks weren't hidden. They were traced, honored. The object wasn't restored to what it was before. It became something else, more honest, more deliberate. Grace smiled a little at the thought, not because it solved anything, just because it felt truer than the idea of going back to normal. She wasn't ready to forgive the way people usually talk about forgiveness. She didn't feel warm or generous. She didn't feel like reaching out. What she felt was tired. Tired of holding something sharp so carefully. She set the mirror down beside the swing and leaned back, letting it sway slightly. The rope creaked again. The sound filled the quiet in a way that didn't demand attention. For the first time in a long while, Grace considered this. maybe forgiveness isn't about the other person at all. Maybe it's about changing how you carry what happened. The mirror, broken and still useful, waited beside her. It wasn't asking to be fixed tonight. It wasn't asking for a decision. It was just there. And for now, that was enough. Grace didn't try to repair the mirror that night. She left it leaning against the porch wall just inside the circle of light. Before going back into the house, she paused and looked at it once more. The crack was still there, clear and honest. Nothing had changed, and yet something had loosened. Inside the house felt quieter than usual. Not silent, just unburdened. Grace moved through the rooms without turning on extra lights. The familiar sounds followed her, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the hallway clock. Ordinary sounds, anchoring sounds. When she washed her hands at the sink, she noticed how warm the water felt against her skin. She let it run a second longer than necessary, watching it slip through her fingers and disappear down the drain. There was no rush to finish, no thought she needed to catch. Anger often convinces us that it's doing something useful, that it's protecting us, that if we keep it close, we won't be hurt again. But standing there, hands wet, shoulders relaxed, Grace could feel how heavy that protection had been, how much effort it took to keep it intact. She dried her hands, slowly folded the towel neatly, and set it back where it belonged. Small motions done without commentary. Her body seemed to know what to do before her mind tried to explain it. Later, lying in bed, Grace stared at the ceiling fan as it turned at its lowest setting. The air moved gently across her face. She didn't replay the old conversation tonight. She didn't rehearse a response she'd never send. The memory still existed somewhere inside her, but it no longer demanded center stage. That surprised her. Forgiveness, she realized, might not arrive as a decision. It might arrive as a quiet reduction. Less tension in the jaw, less replaying, less heat behind the eyes. Not gone, just less. The broken mirror stayed on the porch for days. Grace passed it every morning, every evening. Sometimes she caught her reflection in it, split by that thin line. Sometimes she didn't look at it at all. One afternoon, she brought out a small box from the hall closet. Inside were odds and ends she'd kept without knowing why: buttons, a loose earring, a tiny vial of gold-colored paint left over from a craft project years ago. She set the box down next to the mirror, then laughed softly at herself. Not today, she thought. There was no urgency to make it beautiful yet. What mattered more was that she had stopped seeing the crack as a failure. It was simply a record of pressure, of impact, of something that had met resistance and not fully broken. Grace rocked gently on the porch swing, eyes half closed. The air had cooled. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once, then settled. The world continued without commentary. Anger, when held for too long, keeps the body alert. It tightens muscles. It sharpens the mind. It makes rest feel undeserved. Tonight, rest came without negotiation. Grace didn't forgive anyone in a grand way. She didn't make peace with the past. She didn't rewrite the story. She just stopped gripping it so tightly. And in that small release, something softened. The night felt wider, the air easier to breathe. The broken mirror waited patiently, unchanged. When Grace finally stood up to go inside, she didn't feel the need to bring it with her. It could stay where it was imperfect and whole enough. Some things don't need fixing right away. Some things only need space. As the lights went out and the house settled into its familiar nighttime rhythm, Grace felt her breath slow on its own. No effort, no instruction, just the quiet relief of no longer holding something sharp. The night held everything else. The coffee machine made a tired sound as it finished brewing. Brian stood at the counter of the gas station, one hand on the lid of a paper cup, the other resting on the edge of the sink. It was late enough that the place felt hollow. No line, no rush. Just the hum of the refrigerators and the occasional car passing outside, tires hissing on the road. He added cream without really looking, snapped the lid on, and pressed it down until it clicked. The sound was small, final. He lifted the cup, felt the heat through the cardboard sleeve, and took a careful sip. Too hot. Brian winced, slightly more annoyed than hurt. He blew across the opening, watching steam curl up and disappear. It reminded him of how anger behaves, how it rises fast, looks dramatic for a second, and then vanishes into the air, leaving something else behind. He was 29 in EMT, and he knew more about bodies than he ever planned to. He knew how quickly things could go wrong, how pain traveled, how stress hid itself until it didn't anymore. What he didn't know, what no training had prepared him for, was how to deal with anger that had nowhere to go. The shift had been long, not unusually long, just heavy. Calls that blurred together, a patient who yelled, a family member who blamed him for something he couldn't control, a supervisor who brushed it off with a quick, "You did what you could," and moved on. Brian nodded at the time. Of course he did. He always did. But the anger didn't clock out with him. Now it sat in his chest, tight and sour, like something swallowed too fast. He leaned against the counter and stared at the dark window. His reflection hovered there, distorted by the glass and the glare of fluorescent lights. He looked older than he felt, or maybe more tired than he wanted to admit. There was a phrase he'd heard once, years ago, from a medic who'd been on the job too long to sugarcoat things. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to get sick. At the time, Brian had nodded politely and forgotten it. Tonight, with the cup warm in his hand, the phrase came back with uncomfortable clarity. He took another sip. Slower this time. The coffee had cooled just enough to be drinkable. Bitter. He considered adding sugar, then decided against it. The bitterness felt honest. Anger often disguises itself as strength, as clarity, as righteousness. It tells you you're right to feel this way. That the heat in your chest is proof of something important. But Brian could feel what it was actually doing. It was draining him. Not all at once. Gradually, like a leak you don't notice until the tank is empty. He paid at the register, nodded to the cashier, and stepped back outside. The night air hit his face, cool and clean. He took a deeper breath without meaning to. The gas station lights cast a wide, pale circle on the pavement. Beyond that, everything dissolved into dark. Brian leaned against his car and took another sip. The coffee tasted different out here, less sharp, or maybe his mouth had adjusted. Anger doesn't always want action. Sometimes it just wants attention. It wants to be replayed, reheated, kept warm so it doesn't fade. Brian replayed the moment again, the words that had landed wrong, the look on the family member's face, the way his supervisor had already turned away. Each replay tightened his jaw a little more. His shoulders crept up. His grip on the cup grew firmer. And suddenly, he noticed his hand. How hard he was squeezing. He loosened his fingers just a bit. The cup didn't fall. Nothing bad happened. The coffee stayed right where it was. He let out a breath. Brian wasn't ready to forgive anyone. That word felt too big, too clean, too far away from how he actually felt. Forgiveness sounded like letting someone off the hook, and he wasn't interested in that. What he was interested in, what his body seemed to be asking for, was relief. The kind that comes from not swallowing something harmful just to keep a story alive. He finished the coffee slowly, noticing the warmth move through him. When the cup was empty, he crushed it lightly in his hand and tossed it into the trash. The sound it made was dull, unremarkable. He sat in his car for a moment before starting the engine. The dashboard lights glowed softly. The radio stayed off. There was no need for noise. Brian rested his hands on the steering wheel and stared through the windshield. The anger was still there. He could feel it. But it no longer felt like fuel. It felt like weight. And for the first time that night, he wondered quietly without judgment how much of that weight he was willing to keep carrying. Not for justice, not for principle, just out of habit. The engine started. The car idled. The night waited. Brian didn't drive right away. The engine idled, a low, steady sound, like a reminder that movement was available, but not required. He watched the dashboard lights glow and dim as his eyes adjusted. Outside, a semi passed on the road, the air shifting briefly, then settling again. Anger has a way of convincing you that it needs to stay hot, that if it cools something important, will be lost. Brian knew that feeling well. In his line of work, alertness mattered. Edge mattered. Letting things slide felt dangerous, like lowering your guard at the wrong moment. But sitting there, hands resting on the wheel, he could feel the difference between readiness and tension. One kept you awake, the other just wore you down. He pulled out of the station and drove a few blocks before turning onto a quieter street. Streetlights appeared at regular intervals, pools of light separated by darkness. The rhythm was predictable calming. He matched his speed to it without thinking. At a red light, Brian's mind reached for the scene again. The raised voice, the accusation, the way his chest had tightened. But this time the memory didn't grab him as hard. It was there, but it felt flatter, like a photograph instead of a live feed. He noticed something else too. Each time he replayed it, his body reacted first. The jaw, the shoulders, the shallow breath. The anger wasn't living in the story, it was living in the muscles that held the story in place. The light turned green. He kept driving. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from anger you can't express. It doesn't burn out quickly. It simmers. It keeps the nervous system on standby long after the moment has passed. Brian felt that exhaustion now deeper than the end-of-shift fatigue he was used to. He pulled into his driveway and turned the engine off. The sudden quiet was noticeable, but not jarring. He sat for a moment longer, listening to the metal tick softly as it cooled. Inside the house, he didn't turn on many lights, just the small one near the sink. He set his keys down, washed his hands, and watched the water run clear. The simple act grounded him more than he expected. Warm water, soap, rinse, dry. Anger often asks to be justified. It wants a verdict, a winner. Brian didn't give it that tonight. He gave it space. He moved through his evening routine without rushing, changing clothes, opening a window slightly, letting the cooler air move through the room. His body responded before his thoughts did. The tightness in his chest eased a notch. His breathing lengthened. Lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling and waited for the usual replay to begin. It didn't. Not right away. When the memory finally surfaced, it came without the sharp edge. He saw the faces involved. He saw himself. He saw the limits of what he could have done. There was a strange relief in that. Not because it excused anyone, not because it made the situation fair, but because it stopped demanding that he suffer on someone else's behalf. The phrase returned again, drinking poison and waiting for the other person to get sick. This time it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a description of a habit he no longer needed. Forgiveness, Brian realized, didn't have to mean approval. It didn't have to mean forgetting. It didn't even have to involve the other person. It could simply mean refusing to keep taking the poison. As the room darkened and the sounds of the neighborhood softened, Brian felt his body settle into the mattress. The anger hadn't vanished. It might return tomorrow or the next day or the next difficult call. But tonight, it wasn't in charge. His breath slowed. His thoughts lost their urgency. The mind, no longer fed by heat, began to cool on its own. Somewhere between one breath and the next, the day loosened its grip, and the body, no longer carrying something toxic, was finally allowed to rest. Marcus didn't hear the barking at first. He heard the keys, that familiar metallic clatter as he dropped them into the ceramic bowl by the front door, the sound echoing just slightly in the quiet of his hallway. His shoulders were heavy in that end-of-shift way, UPS. Brown still on him, dust on his shoes, the faint ache in his calves that always showed up right when he stopped moving. It was late enough that the neighborhood looked half asleep. Porch lights were on, windows were dark. Somewhere down the street, a TV flickered behind curtains. Marcus stepped onto his driveway and stood there for a second with his hands on his hips, letting the night air cool the heat under his collar. He wasn't thinking about much. He was thinking about nothing, which was the closest thing to peace he'd had all day. Then it started. A dog 2 houses down barking hard against the fence line. Not a playful bark, The kind that comes from fear or territory, or just too much energy trapped in a small body. Marcus didn't mind dogs. He'd grown up with one. But this bark was sharp, repetitive, relentless, like a car alarm that didn't know it was unwanted. He paused, listening. One bark became 3. 3 became 10. It didn't slow down, didn't soften. It just kept firing. Marcus felt the first spark of irritation in his chest. He'd had a day full of things like this, small annoyances that added up. A customer who yelled because a package was a day late. A car that cut him off. A supervisor who asked him to pick up the pace without asking if he'd eaten lunch. Nothing catastrophic, just pressure without air. Now, standing in his driveway, Marcus could feel his patience thinning at the edges, like paper tearing. The barking slid right into that tear. He looked toward the fence, toward the shadowy shape jumping and barking at nothing. A part of him wanted to yell just a quick "A," to shut it down, to push back, to reclaim silence. Another part of him knew it wouldn't help. You can't argue with a barking dog. You can make noise back. You can throw your own frustration into the air. You can stand there and try to win. But the dog won't suddenly understand your logic and calm down out of respect. It will just bark louder. Not because it's evil, but because it's a dog. Because barking is what it has. Marcus had learned a version of this with people too. There were people you could talk to, people whose anger still had a doorway, still had a handle you could turn, and there were people who were already past that point, already flooded, already barking. Barking back at them never made anything better. It only made more bark. Marcus walked to his front steps and sat down. Not because he was making a point, but because his legs needed it. The wooden step was cool through his pants. He rested his elbows on his knees, watching the dark street. The barking continued, but now it was a little farther from his ears. He could still hear it, but it wasn't inside him. He thought about an argument he'd had with his brother a few months ago. It started over something stupid: who would drive their mom to an appointment. It escalated quickly, like it always did. One sharp sentence, then another, then both of them saying things they didn't mean, just to feel like they weren't losing. Later, Marcus couldn't even remember the original topic. Only the heat, only the tightness in his throat, only the way his hands shook slightly after he hung up. It was like barking, not words, not conversation, just sound and defense and fear pretending to be strength. Marcus stared at the dog's yard in the distance. The fence was too high to see much, but he could hear the rhythm: bark, 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 a brief pause, then more. The dog wasn't angry in a human way. It was overwhelmed. It didn't know what else to do with the feeling in its body. Marcus felt a strange tenderness in that thought. Not for the noise, but for the truth of it. He realized something else. His own irritation was the same kind of feeling. Not elegant, not wise. Just a nervous system that had been running too hard for too long, looking for a place to discharge. It would be easy to aim it outward, to yell, to blame, to make the night hold his frustration. But he didn't want to live like that anymore. He didn't want his home to become another place where he stayed tense and reactive. He wanted his driveway, his porch, his quiet street to mean something. to be a boundary between the day and the rest of his life. Marcus took a slow breath in. The air smelled faintly like cut grass and asphalt cooling down. He exhaled and felt his shoulders lower just a notch. The barking didn't stop, but Marcus stopped tightening against it. Sometimes that's the first move of forgiveness, not toward someone else, but toward your own body. The recognition that you don't have to mirror every disturbance you hear. You don't have to become noise just because noise is nearby. Marcus sat there a while longer. The dog barked. The street stayed still. Somewhere a porch light flicked off. And without any dramatic moment, Marcus felt the urge to bark back fade. Not because he won, because he didn't play. He stood up, went inside, and closed the door gently behind him. The sound sealed off the street. Not all of it, he could still hear the faint barking through the walls. But enough. Enough to rest. Inside, Marcus moved through the house slowly, like he didn't want to wake anything that had finally settled. He set his shoes by the door, washed his hands, and stood at the sink a moment longer than usual, watching the water slide over his fingers. The barking was still there, muted now by walls and distance. It came and went in waves less sharp, easier to ignore. Anger often feels louder when you stand right next to it. When you step back even a little, it changes shape. Marcus dried his hands and leaned against the counter. His body felt tired in a way that didn't need fixing, just noticing. He thought about how many times he'd reacted without choosing to, how often his voice rose just because someone else's did. It wasn't something he was proud of, but it was something he could see clearly now. People don't bark because they're strong. They bark because they're overwhelmed. The next day, that understanding showed up again quietly when Marcus least expected it. He was on his route halfway through the afternoon when a man stormed out of a house waving a missed delivery notice. His face was red. His words came fast and sharp, one on top of the other. "This is ridiculous. I was home. You people never get it right." Marcus stood still, package scanner in hand, feeling the familiar surge rise in his chest. The reflex was there: tighten, defend, explain, push back. His body knew this dance well. For a split second, he almost joined in. Then something small interrupted the pattern. The memory of the dog, the fence, the uselessness of barking back. Marcus noticed the man's eyes, wide, wired, not listening. The words weren't an invitation to talk. They were a release valve. So Marcus didn't bark. He didn't match the volume. He didn't sharpen his tone. He didn't try to win. He stood there steady and let the man's anger pass through the air without catching it. "I hear you," Marcus said calmly. Not apologetic, not defensive, just present. The man paused just long enough for his breath to stumble. The barking slowed, not because Marcus controlled it, but because he didn't feed it. The exchange ended without resolution, without warmth, without a handshake. But it also ended without escalation. And that mattered. Back in his truck, Marcus sat for a moment before starting the engine. His heart wasn't racing. His jaw wasn't clenched. His hands felt steady on the wheel. He hadn't absorbed the anger. That felt new. Forgiveness, he realized, doesn't always look like kindness. Sometimes it looks like containment, like refusing to let someone else's loss of control turn into your own. That evening, when Marcus got home, the street was quieter. The dog was nowhere to be heard. Maybe it was inside. Maybe it was asleep. Maybe it had simply worn itself out. Marcus didn't check. He sat on the porch steps again just for a minute, feeling the day leave his body in small increments. The sky was darker tonight, stars faint but present. The air moved gently, like it wasn't in a hurry. He thought about how often anger invites us to mirror it, to prove we're not weak, to prove we matter. But barking back had never brought him peace. Choosing not to react, that was different. That was a kind of strength no one clapped for, no one noticed. But the body noticed. The nervous system noticed. Marcus stood up and went inside, closing the door softly. The house greeted him with its usual quiet sounds. The refrigerator hum, the distant tick of a clock. Familiar. Safe. In bed later, as the room darkened and his thoughts slowed, he felt something loosen in his chest. Not everything. Just enough. He didn't need to win every interaction. He didn't need to answer every outburst. He didn't need to bark to exist. Some nights, peace comes not from changing the world, but from choosing silence where noise is offered. And in that silence, the body remembers how to rest. Noah didn't notice how tense he was until his hands started to ache. Not pain exactly, more like a deep stiffness under the skin, as if his fingers had been holding something too tightly for too long. He stood in the station's quiet room after shift, the kind of room meant for a few minutes of downtime, with a worn couch, a small lamp, and a humming vending machine in the hallway outside. Most of the guys were in the kitchen joking loudly the way people do when they're trying to shake off a hard day without naming it. Noah could hear them through the door, laughter, a chair scraping, someone slapping the counter. He stayed in here. He was 33, a firefighter, and his body knew how to be ready. Ready meant alert, tight, focused. The kind of readiness that feels like a drawn bowstring. Pulled back muscles engaged everything, waiting for the moment it needs to release. The problem was, nobody tells you how to stop being ready. He sat on the edge of the couch and looked down at his hands. They were clean now, washed well, but the smell of smoke still lingered faintly in the fabric of his uniform. He flexed his fingers once, then again. The stiffness didn't leave. Noah reached for his gloves and loosened the strap. The Velcro made that familiar ripping sound, soft but decisive. He took one glove off, then the other, and set them on the table as if he was putting down something heavier than it looked. A small quiet hit him in the chest. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. He exhaled long and slow, and felt the air move out like a release he didn't know he needed. Anger had been riding him all day, not like a wave, but like tension. Not at any one person, not in a clean direction, more like a pressure that couldn't find a place to land. A call earlier had gone sideways. A house fire that looked contained until it wasn't. A man outside screaming at them to hurry up while they were already moving as fast as human bodies could. A woman crying so hard she couldn't form words. A kid with soot on his face staring past everyone like he was somewhere else. Noah had done his job. That part was clear. What wasn't clear was what to do with what stayed in him after. Because the anger wasn't really about the man yelling, or the traffic that slowed the truck, or the supervisor who barked orders too sharply. It was about the helplessness hiding behind it. The truth nobody wanted to say out loud. Sometimes you do everything right and it still feels like not enough. Noah leaned back into the couch and let his head rest against the cushion. The lamp beside him threw a warm circle of light across the room. The rest stayed dim. He liked that. It didn't demand anything from his eyes. He thought about calling his wife, just to hear her voice. But he knew if he called now while the bowstring was still pulled tight inside him, he might snap over something small. He might bring the heat home. He didn't want to do that. Noah turned his wedding ring slowly on his finger, a habit he didn't notice until he was already doing it. The metal felt cool, grounding, real. He remembered something an older firefighter once told him years ago on his first month at the station. "You can't keep a bow drawn all night," the guy had said, half joking, half serious. "You'll ruin the string and you'll ruin your hands." At the time, Noah thought it was just about physical fatigue. Tonight he understood the other meaning. A nervous system held in readiness too long starts to misfire. It starts to see threats where there aren't any. It starts to respond to harmless questions like they're alarms. It starts to treat the people you love like they're the ones who pulled the string. Noah didn't want to become that. He sat up, placed both feet flat on the floor, and let his hands rest on his thighs. He wasn't trying to meditate. He wasn't trying to be spiritual. He was just trying to loosen the string by 1 inch. He inhaled, feeling the breath fill his chest. He exhaled and imagined, quietly, without forcing it, his shoulders dropping, not collapsing, just releasing the extra effort. Outside the room, the station noise continued. Someone laughed again. The vending machine hummed. A far-off siren passed, then faded. Noah stayed where he was. He didn't chase relief. He didn't chase forgiveness for anyone. He didn't even label his anger as right or wrong. He simply noticed what it did to his body when he held it tightened, jaw tense hands, shallow breath. And he noticed what happened when he loosened the grip, air returned. The chest softened. The ache in his hands eased just slightly. A small difference, but real. He picked up one glove again and turned it over in his hands. The glove was scuffed, darkened from use. It had protected him. It had done its job. It didn't need to stay on him forever. Noah set it down. He leaned back again, eyes half closed, and let the room exist without him managing it, without him staying on guard. In the dim light, his anger started to look less like fire and more like tension that wanted to unwind. Like a bow that had been drawn for too long and was finally being allowed to rest. Noah stayed in the quiet room longer than he meant to. Not because he was avoiding anyone, but because his body hadn't finished letting go yet. When he finally stood up, the stiffness in his hands had softened. Not gone, just less sharp. enough that he could move without feeling like he might snap. He gathered his things and headed out to the truck. The night air outside the station was cool and smelled faintly of damp pavement. He took a deeper breath than he had all day, the kind that drops into your chest without being forced. The drive home was uneventful. Red lights, green lights, familiar turns. His mind reached for the earlier call a few times, the shouting, the smoke, the kid's face. But each time the images faded more quickly. They didn't stick the way they usually did. At home, Noah slipped his boots off by the door and set his gear down where it belonged. The house was quiet. His wife had already gone to bed, a lamp still on in the bedroom, casting a warm glow into the hallway. He paused there, keys in hand. This was usually the moment when the tension followed him inside. When a small noise, a cabinet closing, a question asked too quickly, could set the bowstring vibrating again. He'd learned to recognize that moment by the way his chest tightened in advance, like his body was bracing for impact. Tonight he noticed the bracing and stopped. He set his keys down gently. The sound they made was soft, unthreatening. He stepped out of his uniform and changed into something loose, something that didn't ask his body to stay ready. In the bathroom, he washed his hands and felt the warmth of the water ease the last of the tightness from his fingers. He watched the soot-colored water swirl away and disappear. The image stayed with him longer than he expected. Some things don't need to be carried forward. In bed, Noah lay on his back and stared at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly above him. His wife shifted in her sleep, murmured something unintelligible, then settled again. The sound grounded him. This was home. Not a fire, not a call, not an emergency. The anger surfaced once more, softer now, like an echo. Not at anyone in particular, just the leftover energy of a system that had been pulled to its limit. Noah didn't push it away. He imagined the bow again, the string drawn tight all day, doing exactly what it was meant to do. He imagined his hands loosening their hold just enough, not dropping the bow, not breaking it, just giving it space to rest. His breathing slowed without effort. In, out, steady and even. Forgiveness, he realized, didn't have to be a conversation or a declaration. It could be a physical choice. The choice to stop treating your own body like it's still in danger when the danger has passed. As the minutes went by, the day's sharp edges dulled. The tension that had nowhere to go finally found a place to land. Sleep came quietly, not as an escape, as a return. The bow, no longer drawn, rested beside him. The string loosened, held its shape without strain. And Noah, no longer holding himself at the limit, was allowed to let the night take over. Miguel's hands smelled like garlic even after he washed them. He stood behind the restaurant in the narrow alley where the air was cooler and the noise of the kitchen faded into a distant hum. A single bulb above the back door buzzed softly, attracting nothing but a few tired moths. The night had that end-of-shift stillness, half relief, half emptiness. He turned the faucet on at the small outdoor sink and let cold water run over his fingers. The metal handle was slick. The water hit his skin hard and clear, and for a moment it felt like it cut through everything. Then the feeling came back. The heat, not in his hands, in his chest. Miguel was 45, a line cook who'd spent most of his life moving fast in tight spaces, dodging hot pans and sharp words with the same reflex. He didn't talk much during service. There wasn't time. Communication came in quick signals, behind hot yes chef, and if something went wrong, you fixed it without turning it into a story. But tonight, someone had turned it into a story. A new guy on the line, young, cocky, loud, had made a mistake during the rush, then blamed Miguel for it. Not privately, out loud, in front of everyone. The kind of blame that sticks to you for a second, just long enough to make you feel exposed. Miguel didn't yell back. He didn't fight him on the spot. He just corrected the plate, kept moving, kept his face neutral the way he always did. It was only now in the alley that the anger finally caught up. He scrubbed his hands harder than he needed to, as if the cold water could wash off humiliation. The skin along his knuckles reddened. He didn't care. The anger felt like it needed somewhere to go, and his hands were the closest place. He shut the water off and stood there breathing through his nose. The alley smelled like wet cardboard and dish soap. Somewhere nearby, a dumpster lid clanged shut. A car passed on the street, sound bending around the corner and fading. Miguel replayed the moment. The accusation, the smirk, the laughter from someone who didn't know what else to do. He felt his jaw tighten, his throat go dry. He imagined what he could have said. The perfect comeback. The sharp sentence that would have made the kid shrink. The one that would have restored Miguel's dignity in one clean slice. But dignity doesn't work like that. Not in real life. Not in kitchens. Miguel leaned his forearms on the edge of the sink and stared down at the drain. A slow drip fell from the faucet. 1, 2, 3. A quiet, steady rhythm. He thought of a story his grandmother used to tell in Spanish when he was little, one he didn't fully understand at the time. A snake bites a saw, thinking the saw is an enemy. The saw doesn't react. It doesn't feel pain. It just stays what it is, hard, sharp, unmoving. The snake keeps attacking faster and harder until it's bleeding from its own mouth. In the end, the saw hasn't been harmed at all. The snake has only injured itself. Miguel hadn't thought about that story in years. Tonight it landed with uncomfortable precision. Because the new guy in the kitchen wasn't the saw, not exactly. He was human. He could feel. He could be wrong. He could be cruel. But Miguel's anger, his replaying, his tightening, his imagined arguments, was biting at something that wasn't even here anymore. The moment had passed. The rush was over. The kid was probably inside laughing with someone else or scrolling his phone, not thinking about Miguel at all. Miguel was the one bleeding now, not visibly, but in the way his stomach churned, in the way his shoulders stayed high, in the way he couldn't relax even though the shift was finished. He looked down at his hands again. The skin was red raw from scrubbing. He flexed his fingers and felt a sting. He had done that. Nobody else. Miguel let out a breath and leaned back against the brick wall, feeling its cool roughness through his shirt. He closed his eyes for a second and listened to the quiet. Anger makes you think you're holding power, but a lot of the time it's just holding you. Miguel wasn't ready to forgive the kid. That word felt too soft for what had happened. It wasn't nothing. It had mattered. It had stung. What Miguel wanted was something simpler than forgiveness. He wanted to stop hurting himself after the fact. He wanted to stop biting the saw. He opened his eyes and looked at the alley again. Nothing had changed. The light still buzzed. The water still dripped. The night was still the night. But his attention shifted. Instead of replaying the scene, he noticed his own breathing. Short, high in the chest. He let it drop lower just a little, as if giving his body permission to come down from the rush. He turned the faucet on again, gentler this time, and rinsed his hands without scrubbing. The cold water soothed instead of punished. He watched it run over his skin and disappear, taking the sting down a notch. A small mercy. Miguel dried his hands on a paper towel and threw it away. The towel hit the bin with a soft thud. He stood there, still feeling the anger, but no longer feeding it with motion. No more bites. Just stillness. Miguel locked the back door and stepped onto the sidewalk, the sound of the latch echoing once before fading. The night air felt cooler away from the kitchen vents, cleaner somehow. He walked a few blocks before reaching his car, letting the movement work the last of the rush out of his body. The anger came with him. Not sharp now, heavy, like something lodged under the ribs that made breathing feel a little shorter than usual. He drove with the window cracked open, city sounds slipping in and out, streetlights passing in a steady rhythm. At a red light, his hands tightened on the steering wheel without him noticing. His jaw followed. The scene replayed again, uninvited. The kid's voice, the laughter, the look that said, "It's not my fault." Miguel felt the old urge to bite again, to chew the moment until it bled out every possible ending. He noticed it this time. The urge itself. How it rose up hot and immediate, asking for teeth. He loosened his grip. Just a little. The light turned green. He drove on. At home, the apartment was dark and quiet. Miguel dropped his keys on the counter and stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. No orders, no timers, no voices cutting through the air, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of the clock on the wall. He poured himself a glass of water and drank it slowly. The coolness settled his stomach. He felt the day sink lower in his body, inch by inch. Miguel sat at the small kitchen table and rested his forearms on the wood. The surface was smooth from years of use. He traced a shallow scratch with his finger, following it until it disappeared under his hand. The anger hadn't vanished. It still made sense. It still had reasons. But it no longer felt urgent. Forgiveness, he realized, didn't have to mean letting the kid off the hook. It didn't have to mean pretending the disrespect hadn't happened. It didn't even have to involve another conversation. It could simply mean choosing not to keep chewing on the blade. Miguel stood up and went to the sink again, this time to wash a single cup. He moved slowly, deliberately. No scrubbing, no punishment, just water and motion. In bed later, he lay on his back and stared at the ceiling. The apartment made its usual nighttime sounds. Somewhere a neighbor's TV murmured. Pipes shifted. The building breathed around him. The memory came back one last time, but without the edge. It felt distant now, like something that had already happened instead of something still happening. Miguel pictured the saw from his grandmother's story. Solid, unmoving, uninterested in the snake's fury. It wasn't proud. It wasn't cold. It simply didn't participate. He let that image settle. Not everything needs a response. Not every insult needs teeth. Some things lose their power when you stop attacking them. His breathing slowed. The tension in his shoulders eased. The anger, no longer sharpened by replay, softened into fatigue, the honest kind that comes at the end of a long day's work. As sleep approached, Miguel felt the quiet relief of no longer fighting something that wasn't fighting back. The saw remained what it was. The snake finally still stopped hurting itself. And in that stillness, the night took over, gentle and unremarkable, letting the body rest without one more bite. There are moments when anger arrives quietly, not as an explosion, but as a tightening. The jaw sets, the shoulders lift, the mind begins to gather evidence. It doesn't feel dramatic, it feels justified. And that's what makes it hard to notice. It happened after a meeting that ran a little longer than planned. A comment was made, not loud, not cruel on the surface, just sharp enough to land, sharp enough to replay itself on the drive home. The car was parked in the company lot, engine already off, but the body hadn't caught up yet. The steering wheel was still warm from both hands gripping it too tightly. Outside the building, lights hummed. Somewhere far away, another car door closed. The world had moved on. Inside the car, the moment was still stuck. The comment kept looping. The tone, the timing, the way it had landed in front of others. The mind began filling in the rest. They meant that. They always do this. They don't respect me. Anger likes to pretend it's clear-sighted. It says I see exactly what happened. But often it's working with very little information and a very loud story. A coffee cup sat in the holder between the seats. The lid clicked softly as it was twisted back and forth, back and forth. The motion was automatic. Something the hands did when the mind didn't know where else to go. It felt obvious who was wrong. It felt obvious who had crossed a line. And it felt necessary to hold on to that feeling, as if letting it go would mean admitting something painful, or worse, letting someone get away with it. But there was a small pause. Not a decision, just a pause. In that pause, a strange image surfaced. Not related to work, not related to the meeting. Just an image of someone watching a musician play without being able to hear the music. Watching the movement, the expressions, the timing of the hands, and deciding based on that alone what the music must be. It's easy to judge a performance when you can't hear the sound. The thought wasn't comforting. It was unsettling. Because it suggested something uncomfortable, maybe the picture being judged wasn't complete. Maybe the mind was reacting to movement without sound, action without context, words without the story behind them. The anger didn't disappear. It stayed, warm and tight, but it shifted slightly. From "they're wrong" to "I might not be hearing the whole thing." That shift didn't feel noble. It felt irritating. Part of the mind wanted to snap back into certainty. Certainty feels safer than ambiguity. Certainty lets anger stretch its legs and settle in. But ambiguity has a way of loosening things. The parking lot light flickered once, then steadied. The coffee lid clicked again. A breath went in a little deeper than before. Another went out a little slower, not intentionally, just because the body does that when it senses there might be less danger than it thought. Anger often assumes intent. It assumes meaning. It assumes knowledge. It fills in gaps quickly and confidently. And when it does, it usually puts the heaviest weight on the worst explanation. But intent lives in a place we don't have access to. It lives in histories we don't know, pressures we don't see, worries that don't announce themselves. It doesn't mean the comment was fine. It doesn't mean it didn't hurt. It just means the story built around it might be louder than the facts. There was a moment of imagining the other person's day. Not in detail. Not as an excuse. Just a brief acknowledgement that there was a day. Emails, deadlines, their own internal weather, a song playing in their head that no one else could hear. That thought didn't soften everything, but it interrupted the momentum. Anger needs momentum. It needs agreement. It needs repetition. When it doesn't get those, it starts to lose its grip. The hand stopped twisting the coffee lid. It rested there instead. The chest still felt tight, but not as locked. The mind still had opinions, but they were less sharp, less eager to attack. It became possible, just possible, to see that reacting fully right now would be like judging a piece of music while wearing earplugs. Confident, loud, and probably wrong in important ways. Nothing was resolved in that car. No forgiveness was granted. No insight was crowned as wisdom. There was only a small restraint, a choice not to throw the hot coal immediately. The engine was still off. The night was still early. And for the first time since the meeting ended, the anger wasn't being fed. It was just there, waiting, unsure if it would be picked up again. The anger didn't leave that night. It rarely does just because it's been noticed. Instead, it changed shape. It became quieter, more patient. The kind of anger that waits until later, until the house is dark and the mind has room to wander. At-home shoes were kicked off near the door. The kitchen light stayed off. Only the soft glow from a lamp in the living room filled the space. Everything felt normal, almost calm. And that's usually when the mind decides it's safe to continue. The comment returned, but this time with edits. New wording, better comebacks. A version of the conversation where things were said clearly, firmly, perfectly. Where respect was demanded and received. Anger likes to rehearse. It believes that if it can get the script right, the pain will disappear, or at least feel justified. A phone sat face down on the coffee table. It would be easy to pick it up, to send a message, to clarify, to correct, to make sure the other person understood exactly how it felt. The urge felt clean, responsible even. This isn't anger, the mind whispered. This is standing up for yourself. But there was that earlier image again, the person watching music without sound, judging tempo without hearing rhythm, deciding meaning from movement alone. What if this response too was being written without hearing the full song? That question didn't stop the urge. It just slowed it. Enough to notice something else underneath the anger. Not rage, not hatred. Something more fragile. Embarrassment. A sense of being exposed. The old ache of wanting to be taken seriously. Anger often arrives as protection. It steps in front of softer feelings and speaks loudly so they don't have to. The phone stayed on the table. Not because of discipline, because the body felt tired of holding a shield all the time. A glass of water was poured at the sink. The sound was steady, ordinary. The kind of sound that doesn't demand attention. The glass was fuller than intended. Water crept toward the edge and spilled slightly onto the counter. It wasn't dramatic, just enough to notice. The towel was grabbed without irritation. The spill wiped up. No commentary, no blame, no lingering. It was such a small thing. But it landed. Problems don't always need to be thrown away. Some things are cleaned, quietly, without punishment. The mind returned to the moment in the meeting, the tone, the timing. And then for the first time, another possibility was allowed to exist alongside the original story. Not replacing it, just sitting next to it. What if that comment wasn't aimed? What if it wasn't about me? What if it came from stress, not intent? These questions didn't excuse the impact. They didn't erase the sting. But they loosened the grip of certainty. And certainty is what turns anger into a prison. Forgiveness is often misunderstood. It's imagined as something generous, something done for another person, a gift, a moral achievement. But more often, forgiveness begins as a practical decision, a refusal to keep replaying the same scene in the same tone, a choice to stop letting the nervous system stay on high alert for something that already passed. The anger was still there, but it was no longer being sharpened. The mind tried once more to rehearse the conversation. This time it didn't have as much energy. The lines sounded forced, overworked, like a joke told too many times. The body shifted on the couch. A deeper breath came and went. Not because it was instructed to, because there was room for it now. It became clear that holding on to the anger wasn't keeping anyone accountable. It was just keeping the moment alive, over and over, long after it needed to be. And maybe that's what forgiveness actually is. Not saying what you did was fine, not pretending it didn't hurt, but deciding that the moment doesn't get unlimited access to your nights. The thought of responding tomorrow after sleep, after space, felt different than responding now. Less charged, less urgent, more grounded. That difference mattered. The lamp was turned off. The room darkened. The house made its small, settling sounds. Pipes, walls, the quiet proof that time was moving forward, whether the mind cooperated or not. Anger can be like listening to only the loudest instrument in a song and assuming that's all there is. Forgiveness doesn't require loving the music. It only asks that you admit there might be more playing than you can hear right now. Lying there, nothing was resolved. No apologies imagined, no outcomes guaranteed. Just a body that no longer needed to stay clenched around a single note. The anger wasn't gone, but it wasn't in charge. And for tonight, that was enough. Some anger doesn't feel like heat. It feels like distance. It shows up as a short reply, a delayed call back, a quick change of subject. It doesn't slam doors, it just quietly keeps them half closed. That kind of anger had been around for a long time, long enough that it stopped feeling like anger and started feeling like a personality trait. This is just how we are. This is just how it went. We don't talk about that. The kitchen was quiet that night. A single light above the island was on, warm but not bright. A cup of tea sat cooling on the counter. The house made soft noises, pipes settling the refrigerator, humming the faint click of a ceiling fan switching speeds in another room. A hand rested on the edge of the counter. The skin there had a scar, not a dramatic one, not something strangers asked about, just a pale line that caught the light when the wrist turned. The scar came from years ago, a simple accident, a broken glass in the sink, a fast reach without thinking, a sharp sting, then blood, then stitches, then time. Now, it was mostly forgotten. Until moments like this, when the body was still and the mind wandered to places it usually avoided. The anger wasn't about the scar, but the scar reminded the mind of something else, another old wound. One that didn't show on the skin. A family argument from years ago. Not even a single argument, really. More like a long series of little misunderstandings collected and stacked until one day, something heavy fell. There had been harsh words, a story told wrong, a phone call that ended too fast, a holiday that felt awkward, and then slowly, the silence became normal. No one declared a cutoff. No one officially ended things. It just became easier not to try, easier not to risk more disappointment. That night, the tea had gone lukewarm. It was lifted anyway. A small sip. The taste was flat. The cup was set back down with a soft clink. The scar caught the light again. There was a strange thing about scars. They're proof that something happened, but they're also proof that something ended. The wound closed. The skin decided it would keep going. The mind returned to the old family moment and immediately tried to make it simple. They were wrong. I was right. They never apologized. I didn't deserve that. It's comforting to keep the story clean. Clean stories are easy to hold, but real life is rarely that neat. A thumb traced the scar without thinking. The skin there was smooth, but different. Not painful, just changed. The thought came softly, if this scar could heal without becoming the whole hand, maybe the old hurt didn't have to become the whole relationship. Not a command, not a lesson, just a possibility. Forgiveness is often imagined as a big moment. A phone call, a speech, a tearful reunion. But most of the time it starts much smaller. It starts as a shift inside the person carrying the weight, a willingness to loosen the grip, not because the other person earned it, but because holding it has started to cost too much. The kitchen light stayed steady. The house stayed quiet. Outside, a car passed, and the headlights slid across the wall for a second, then disappeared. The mind tried to argue with the softness. If I let this go, they win. If I forgive, it means it wasn't a big deal. If I soften, I'm saying it was okay. But forgiveness doesn't mean the wound didn't happen. It means the wound doesn't get to keep bleeding every time you touch it. The scar on the wrist wasn't an apology from the glass. It wasn't justice. It was just the body moving on. The mind didn't like that comparison. The mind wanted something cleaner. A clear apology, a clear admission, a clear ending. But life doesn't always give that. Sometimes the only clarity available is the choice to stop reopening the wound. Another sip of tea, still lukewarm, still not great, and yet drinkable. That was how the relationship felt in the mind sometimes. Not perfect, not warm, but still there, still possible. The question wasn't, should I go back to how it was? That was impossible. The question was something quieter. Can I let it be changed without letting it be dead? The scar didn't answer. It just existed. Calm, neutral, honest. A text message sat unsent in the phone's draft folder. Not a full conversation, just a line that had been typed and deleted a few times over the last month. Something simple like, "Hey, I was thinking about you." It wasn't sent that night. But the idea of sending it stopped feeling like weakness. It started to feel like strength, the same kind of strength that heals. Not loud strength, not proud strength, just steady strength. The light above the island hummed softly. The tea cooled further. The hand rested again on the counter scar, visible not as a flaw, but as evidence. Evidence that something can hurt and still become something you live with. The next morning arrived quietly. No dramatic shift in feeling, just a slightly different weight in the chest, the kind you only notice because it's lighter than before. Sunlight slipped into the kitchen in thin lines. Dust moved slowly through it. The scar on the wrist looked different in daylight, less noticeable, almost ordinary. A phone buzzed once on the counter, a notification from a news app. Nothing important. Still, the screen lit up and the draft message appeared again when the phone was unlocked. The words were still there, simple, unfinished. The mind hesitated. It always did at this point. It brought up the old list, what was said, what wasn't said, who should have reached out first, how long it had been. Forgiveness doesn't erase memory. It changes how memory sits in the body. The scar didn't hurt when the wrist moved. It didn't reopen just because it was seen. It stayed closed, doing its quiet work. That didn't mean the past was harmless. It meant the past no longer had sharp edges. A photo frame was picked up from the shelf. Not a carefully chosen one. Just something that had ended up there over the years. A family picture from long ago. Everyone younger. Everyone trying in their own way. It was easier now to see how many versions of the story had existed at once. Everyone holding their own piece. Everyone convinced theirs was the full picture. Anger had once helped create distance. Distance had helped reduce pain, but over time, distance had started to feel like something else, like numbness. And numbness isn't the same as peace. The phone was set back down, not to avoid the message, but to give the moment more space. This didn't need to be rushed. Healing rarely does. The idea of forgiveness still felt misunderstood. It wasn't about pretending things were fine. It wasn't about reopening old patterns. It wasn't about going back. It was about letting the scar be a scar. Not a wound, not an identity. Later, while rinsing a mug in the sink, the water ran over the wrist again. The skin there was warm, alive, responsive. The mind noticed something else then. The anger that had once flared around the memory didn't show up the same way anymore. It didn't leap forward. It didn't demand attention. It felt tired, like it had done its job and didn't need to keep working. There was a relief in that, a quiet one. Forgiveness doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with certainty. Sometimes it shows up as the absence of the old reaction. A holiday card arrived in the mail later that week. The handwriting on the envelope was familiar. The sight of it used to cause an immediate tightening. This time the reaction came, and then passed. The card was opened, read once, then set down. No response was sent that day, and that was okay. Forgiveness doesn't require immediate action. It doesn't force connection before the system is ready. The scar remained, visible in some light, invisible in others. It no longer felt like proof of damage. It felt like proof of endurance. The past couldn't be undone. The relationship couldn't return to its old shape. But neither needed to be erased. The idea of reaching out shifted again, from I should to I might, from obligation to choice. That difference mattered. The phone stayed nearby. The message draft stayed simple. No explanations, no apologies demanded. Just an opening, a small one. Whether it would be sent tomorrow or next month didn't feel urgent anymore. Healing doesn't mean everything is fixed. It means the pain has stopped asking for your full attention. The scar had stopped asking for it long ago. Standing there, the wrist turned slightly. The light caught the pale line once more, not as a reminder of what was lost, but of what had already survived. And for now, that was enough. They hear the noise just as they're about to sit down. It's a soft sound, barely more than a shift of air coming from somewhere deeper in the apartment. Not loud enough to alarm, but distinct enough to interrupt the moment. They pause, one hand still resting on the back of the chair, listening. The place is mostly dark. Only the hallway light is on, casting a long strip of yellow across the floor. The rest of the rooms sit quietly, holding their shapes in shadow. They stand still for a few seconds, letting their eyes adjust, letting their breath slow. Another sound follows, subtle again, like a drawer settling or a door frame expanding in the night air. Their mind moves faster than their body. Did I leave something open? Did I lock the door properly? What if someone's here? They don't panic, but a familiar tightness gathers in their chest, the kind that arrives before logic has a chance to speak. They reach for the phone in their pocket without looking at it, feeling its solid weight in their hand. They tell themselves it's probably nothing. Old buildings make noise. Wood shifts. Pipes knock. They've lived here long enough to know that. Still, they don't sit down. They walk slowly toward the sound footsteps, careful, controlled. The hallway seems longer than usual, the shadows thicker. Each step forward sharpens their awareness, drawing their thoughts inward. In moments like this, their mind is quick to inventory everything they care about. The things that could be lost. The things that matter. The things they would hate to see taken. But as they move from room to room turning on lights, they realize something strange. There isn't much here. The living room holds a couch, a small table, a shelf with a few books. The bedroom is simple. The closet half empty. The kitchen clean, almost bare. Nothing valuable sits out. Nothing precious is on display. The noise doesn't repeat itself. They stand in the center of the apartment, lights on, now the earlier tension easing into something quieter. The space feels open, unguarded. Not empty in a sad way, just uncluttered. They lower themselves onto the couch and set the phone down beside them. The silence returns steady and unremarkable. Their heart rate slows. They think about how different this feels from other nights, other moments, when a single thought has set off a cascade of worry. Times when their mind raced ahead, protecting imaginary losses, rehearsing reactions, clinging tightly to outcomes that hadn't happened yet. Tonight, there's nothing to rehearse. The apartment doesn't ask them to defend it. There's nothing here that feels fragile enough to break their calm. They lean back and let their head rest against the cushion. The fabric is cool. The air feels still again. It occurs to them how much of their anxiety has worked this way. A sudden thought appears something might go wrong, and immediately their mind fills with things to protect. Expectations, plans, identities, ideas of how life should unfold. The tighter they hold, the more there seems to be at risk. They look around the room again, really look this time. The simplicity feels intentional now, even if it wasn't always meant to be. Fewer objects, fewer reminders, less to lose. A faint smile crosses their face. They've spent years trying to secure their inner world the way people secure their homes. Locks, alarms, constant vigilance, always checking to make sure nothing has been taken. But what if the reason the noise didn't turn into anything was simpler than that? What if there was nothing here for it to take? The thought settles gently, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility. They sit there a little longer, listening to the quiet, noticing how the mind deprived of something to defend begins to relax on its own. Thoughts still appear, but they don't grab hold. They pass through unchallenged. The house remains still, and for the first time in a while, so do they. They don't get up right away. The couch supports their weight without complaint, and the quiet settles in around them like it has decided to stay. Whatever made the noise earlier has resolved itself, or maybe it never meant anything to begin with. Either way, the moment has passed. Their thoughts don't rush to replace it. They notice how different this feels from the usual aftermath of fear. Normally, Even after realizing there's no danger, their body stays alert as if it doesn't trust the conclusion. Tonight, the tension fades almost immediately, leaving behind a calm that feels unearned and yet welcome. They look around the room again, slower this time. The shelf holds a few books, well worn, not precious. The table bears faint scratches from daily use. The lamp gives off a soft light that doesn't try to impress. None of it feels like something that needs guarding. They think about how often their mind behaves like a house filled with valuables. Every thought labeled important, every feeling protected, every outcome guarded as if losing it would mean losing something essential. No wonder anxiety shows up like a thief. When the mind is crowded with attachments, there's always something at risk. They shift slightly, pulling one leg up onto the couch, settling into a more comfortable position. The movement feels unguarded, natural. Their breathing deepens, and with it comes a gentle clarity. They recall moments when worry has taken over completely. Nights spent replaying conversations, days spent bracing for outcomes that never arrived. In those moments, their mind was full of expectations, full of imagined losses, full of stories about what must be protected at all costs. The thief had plenty to take. Tonight feels different. There's still responsibility, still care, still a sense of direction. But the tight grip around it all has loosened. The house, so to speak, is simpler now. Fewer locked doors, fewer things stacked in the corners. A thought appears quiet, but familiar. What if something goes wrong tomorrow? They notice it without reacting. The thought lingers briefly, then fades, finding nothing to latch onto. No argument rises to meet it. No counterplan forms. The question simply dissolves unanswered and unneeded. They're surprised by how natural that feels. For a long time, they've believed that worrying is a form of responsibility, that holding on to every possible outcome is how you stay prepared, how you prove you care. Letting go has felt reckless, even immature. But sitting here now, they sense the opposite. Letting go doesn't mean abandoning life. It means not gripping it so tightly that it bruises. They stand and walk through the apartment once more, not to check for danger, but to experience the space as it is. The floor is cool under their feet. The walls feel solid. The air is still. Nothing asks for defense. They turn off a light, then another, leaving only a small glow in the bedroom. As the rooms darken, the apartment feels larger, more spacious, like it's breathing out. They pause in the doorway and look back one last time. The living room holds its quiet shape unchanged by their shifting attention. The earlier fear feels distant now, almost abstract. Not something to analyze, just something that came and went. They realize that peace didn't arrive because they proved the house was safe. It arrived because they stopped guarding something that didn't need guarding. They sit on the edge of the bed and remove their shoes, placing them neatly by the door. The simple ritual grounds them, signals an ending without ceremony. As they lie down, the thought crosses their mind again, faint and curious. What if worry comes back? They smile softly. If it does, it will arrive to an empty house. The lights are off. The doors are open. There's nothing here for it to steal. They pull the blanket up and let the darkness settle, feeling the quiet hold steady inside them. Tonight, nothing is being protected, and nothing is being lost. The sound reaches him before he knows what it is. It drifts through the open car window, thin and uneven, rising and falling with no clear pattern. At first he thinks it's just the wind slipping between buildings, the way it sometimes whistles when the night air cools. He turns the engine off and sits still. The parking lot is almost empty, lit by a few tall lamps that hum softly above the asphalt. His shift ended a few minutes ago, but he hasn't driven away yet. He often stays like this, letting the car settle, letting his thoughts catch up to the quiet. The sound comes again. This time it's unmistakable. A few notes, then a pause. Then another note, stretched and fragile, as if the person playing it isn't sure where the melody is going. A flute? He leans back in the seat and listens. The music isn't polished. There's no rhythm he can tap his fingers to, no song he recognizes. The notes arrive one by one, separated by long spaces of silence. Sometimes the silence lasts longer than the sound itself. Normally, this is the moment when his mind would fill in the gaps. He would start thinking about the day, replaying routes, conversations with passengers. Small moments of irritation or kindness that stayed with him longer than expected. Tonight, something interrupts that habit. The pauses between the notes hold his attention. Each time a sound fades, there is a stretch of nothing before the next one begins. The silence isn't empty or awkward. It feels intentional, as if it's part of the music rather than a mistake. He notices his breathing syncing with it. Inhale during the sound, exhale into the quiet. The flute plays again, softer now, almost hesitant. The note wavers, then dissolves into the night. He waits, not knowing when the next one will come, and realizes he isn't impatient. He's listening. For a long time, he's believed that his thoughts work the same way, one appearing after another, non-stop demanding attention. He's tried to quiet them before, to push them away, to replace them with better ones. None of that has lasted. Sitting here now, he notices something different. Between one thought and the next, there is a pause. It's brief, easy to miss, but it's there. Another note floats through the air, then stops abruptly. The silence that follows feels wide, almost spacious. In that space, there's no problem to solve. No memory pulling at him, no plan forming. Just listening. He hears a door close somewhere nearby. A distant car passes on the street beyond the lot. The night holds these sounds gently, letting them come and go without layering them into a story. The flute resumes a little steadier now, as if the player has relaxed into the rhythm of the night. The melody never fully forms. It suggests something, then lets it go. He smiles faintly. That's how his mind has been lately. Half-formed thoughts. Ideas that start and stop. Worries that don't quite land anywhere, but still leave him tired from carrying them. He shifts in his seat, feeling the fabric beneath him, the solid presence of the steering wheel under his hands. The car is off quiet, a small contained space within the larger night. The flute pauses again. This time he doesn't wait for the next note. He stays with the silence itself, noticing how it feels in his body. His shoulders drop, his jaw unclenches. The constant low hum inside his head softens, not because it's been silenced, but because it no longer has to compete with anything. A thought arises, something about tomorrow's schedule. He notices it. Then, like a note that's already fading, it passes, leaving behind another pause. The realization settles slowly. He doesn't need to chase every thought to the end. He doesn't need to finish every mental sentence. There is rest available in the space between them. The flute plays once more and then stops for longer than before. He wonders if the player has finished or simply taken a break. The not knowing doesn't bother him. The parking lot remains still. The night feels wide and patient. He stays where he is, listening, not for the next sound, but for the quiet that holds it. He stays in the car even after the music fades. For a while, there is nothing but the quiet hum of the lamps above the parking lot and the faint sound of air moving through the trees at the edge of the street. The flute doesn't return right away, and he doesn't look for it. He listens to what's left behind. The silence feels different now. Not like something missing, but like something present in its own right. It has texture, depth. It holds the space the way water holds a stone without asking it to disappear. His mind reaches out again, out of habit, searching for the next thing to think about. A memory starts to form, then hesitates, as if it's unsure whether it needs to fully arrive. He notices the hesitation. In that small gap, there is ease. The thought dissolves before it becomes a story, leaving behind a softness he doesn't usually feel at this hour. His breathing deepens naturally, falling into a slower rhythm that doesn't require effort or control. The flute returns just one note this time, clear and brief, then silence again. He smiles almost without realizing it. The music isn't trying to entertain him. It isn't trying to fill the night. It's simply appearing when it appears, then stepping aside. He realizes how often he's done the opposite with his thoughts. Filled every gap, labeled every pause as wasted time, treated silence like something that needed to be fixed. No wonder his mind has been so tired. He rests his head back against the seat and closes his eyes. The darkness behind his eyelids feels kind, not heavy. Sounds pass through distant traffic, a faint click as a light flickers, the soft rustle of leaves, and then they're gone. Another thought appears. This one stays for a moment. It doesn't rush. It doesn't demand. It simply floats, then drifts off on its own, like a note that knows when to end. He doesn't follow it. The space that opens afterward feels wide enough to breathe in. The flute stops completely now. He waits, but nothing else takes its place. No replacement sound. No internal commentary rushing in to explain the quiet. Just this. He understands something then, not as an idea, but as a felt experience. Peace isn't the absence of sound or thought. It's the ability to rest between them. The engine remains off. The car stays still. He feels grounded in his body, present in a way that doesn't require effort. The overthinking that usually swells at the end of the day has nowhere to build momentum. There are too many pauses, He opens his eyes and looks out through the windshield. The parking lot looks the same as it did before, ordinary and unremarkable. But his relationship to it has shifted. He's no longer waiting for something to happen. The moment is already enough. Eventually, he reaches for the door handle and steps out of the car. The cool night air greets him light against his skin. He locks the door and stands there for a second, listening. No flute, no rush of thought. Just the quiet space that holds both. As he walks away, his steps find a gentle rhythm, unforced. Thoughts still come, but they arrive like visitors who know they don't need to stay long. Each one passes through the wide silence, leaving it unchanged. By the time he reaches the corner of the lot, the music feels like something that happened long ago, already complete. The silence remains. He carries it with him, not as something to protect or recreate, but as something he knows how to recognize now. The night doesn't ask him to do anything more. And for once, his mind doesn't either. Wherever you are tonight, I'm grateful you chose to spend this quiet time here. If these stories help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need a gentle place to land. And now, you don't need to do anything more. Let the night hold what you can't carry. And if sleep comes, let it come.